Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Watson. I work at Cook Inlet Tribal Council as our Senior Manager of Tribal Relations. Welcome to session 3 of our grant management training. As a reminder, this training is a partnership between CITC, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and the goal is to improve and develop capacity around the Cook Inlet region with grant writing resources. I would love to introduce Emily and her team now. Emily, would you mind introducing yourself to the group?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Edenshaw. I have the honor to live and work on the Dena'ina lands as the president and CEO of the Alaska Native Heritage Center. I'm Yupik and Inupiaq. My family comes from Emonic, Alaska. And I will turn it over to Jennifer and then Greg.
Hello, I'm Jennifer McBride. I'm the finance director here at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. And yeah, I'm excited to share some of the things that we've learned over the years in terms of grant budgeting and administration and the like.
And I am Greg Stewart. I am the grant writer and admin manager at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. So I mostly prepare our grant applications, but help to oversee a lot of different aspects of grant administration. I'm also excited to see some engagement with the budgeting and finance side of things that Jennifer will lead.
Perfect. Excellent. And if we could do maybe brief introductions, if you could just share your name, role, and where you're, what organization you work for, that would be great. Brianne, would you mind going first?
I would be happy to. Hello, everyone. My name is Brianne Davis. I am the Senior Manager for Alaska's People with Cook Inlet Tribal Council.
Okay, thank you. Drew.
Hello, my name is Drew Regner. I'm with Connect Tribe, and I'm the STEAM Academy Manager.
Perfect. And Tiara?
Hi, I'm Tiara McDougall. I'm the Apprenticeship and Internship Manager for Alaska's People.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Emily and Jennifer now.
Yeah, sure. And I want to say, Taylor, are you on? I want to make sure that you have a chance to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Hurlber. I am the Vista for Grants Management at the Heritage Center. Grad,
Awesome.
but so this is my first time learning about Jennifer's side of everything.
Well, awesome. It's so nice to have everyone here. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's make sure. Give me 1 second. I want to make sure I'm doing this right. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I want to make sure, are you seeing the full screen? Are you seeing the note side as well?
We're seeing the note side as well.
Huh. Okay, hold on. Let me see how I can do this. Sorry, I don't know how to.
Yeah, it's always a challenge with the PowerPoint these days.
Do you know how I get rid of that?
Actually, that looks like just a slide.
It does.
Yep.
Is that, you got the full slide?
Just the
looks
slides.
good.
Looks good.
Okay, well, I'll start from the beginning. Sorry about that. You would think that I'm an expert on Zoom, but I'm not. But today we're going to be talking about grant management budgets, building budgets. And I just want to say, you know, this is something, as I shared in my previous presentations, it's really taken years for me to really understand budgets, understanding that data tells a story, budgets tell a story. And one of my biggest hope for you all, you know, a takeaway for you all is that you really leave just knowing that the more you build budgets, the more you immerse yourself in them, you're going to get, not only are you going to gain experience, but you're really going to grow your skill and understanding and, you know, not only the inner workings of various grants, but why grant budgets, but why is it so important? And so, as I shared, we're going to be talking about budgets today, and I'm going to just really do a quick introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. So when we're talking about a budget, you know, and I want to make sure that I don't assume that everyone on the call today has built a budget. If you're like me, and if you went through, you know, our education system, this really wasn't part of like our Professional development class. This isn't something that I learned in high school, although I wish we had. I think those fundamental concepts of who and what a budget is and why it's important, for me, I had to learn as an adult. And so the one thing I'll just say is that a budget is really at the heart of it. It's really what you're communicating to the funder of what you are requesting funding for, item by item. It's not that end amount of, my budget is $1 million, my budget is $50,000. It really is an item by item description of what you are trying to ask the funder for. And the one thing that I tell people, and I really try to explain, is that a budget, when you're building it, it's completely separate from a budget narrative. And the best way that I could describe it is, once you build your budget, it's then justified by your budget narrative. And it really does explain, like I said, it provides that explanation to the funder of what the funds are going to be used for. So some key concepts that I want to make sure that everyone walks away knowing is, first and foremost, make sure that your budget is realistic. So really don't try to overstate or understate, or, don't just try to pull numbers from the sky. Really make sure that it is realistic. And again, you're going to want to provide as much detail as possible. One thing that I've learned over the years is, when you have a really detailed budget, it's actually easier to justify. And so just keep that in your mind. Another thing I want to make sure that when you're looking at not only grant applications and you're building your budget, be sure to draw your attention to what expenses are allowed. And I know Jennifer is going to be talking a little bit about that later. Also, make sure that you look at budget limits and the guidelines. And so a good example is, if you're trying to go after, you have a $2 million project, and you're trying to go after, say, for example, a Siri Foundation grant, understanding that there might be budget limits, with TCF, or there might be budget limits with NEA. And that's another acronym that, in my first presentation, I shared out. But just know that it's going to depend not only on the funding opportunity, but also, like I said, make sure that you're, once you have your project identified, that you're really looking at the budget limit and the funding that you're going after. As I shared here, cost out your project as it's being developed. And things are going to come up, and just know, and this is something an elder once told me, be more like water and not like flypaper. And that's something that I constantly remind myself, especially when I'm building budgets. The way that I also look at budgets is, use this as an opportunity to get creative, but again, make sure that you're following the guidelines. Some other things I want to just pull your attention to is, always make sure that you're following the grant maker's direction, and do not put the budget off last. And again, I think, going back to the other presentations, we know, and we're actually experiencing this right now at the Heritage Center, when you want to go and you want to apply, to a funding opportunity, you don't want to do your budget at the 11th hour. So really, make sure that you develop kind of good form at the beginning, and make sure that you're not looping it in on the back end. So some other items that I wanted to share here. So develop a spreadsheet from scratch, or use a template. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are so many different templates out there. I am happy to share some with you. I'll make sure that we get them out to Eric. Just know that various funding agencies also have their own templates. Do not reinvent the wheel. But I will say, on the other side of that coin, a great way for you to develop your skills is to maybe start from scratch. And, just once you have that under your belt, then just, maybe look for templates. But it is a great way for you to kind of gain your expertise in that area. When you're developing your budget, always think of your strategic plan in mind. This is something that we've talked about in other presentations. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but again, making sure when you're going after funding and you're building your budget, always make sure that it's in line with your strategic plan, your department plan, and obviously to make sure that it's supporting a project. as I've shared, and I know Jennifer is going to probably emphasize this, take advantage of any sort of training that's available. As I've mentioned, the best way for you to start, gaining your experience is just to jump right in and to do it. That's the way that I learned. I also went to school, but by no means am I an expert. I don't even know how many times I go to Jennifer and I ask Jennifer for help. But again, just know that there are so many trainings out there that you should take advantage of. The last thing I really want to emphasize on this slide is when you're building your budget and you're going after a grant opportunity or you're creating a budget amendment, really keep in mind the philosophy of the budget. And I know that you might be scratching your head and like, what do you mean by that, Emily? One example that I'm going to share with you is when we were going after an Economic Development Administration grant, their philosophy at the EDA is to get more funding out into the community versus the organization. So we might have a $200,000 grant, but let's say, for example, more than 150,000 of that is going out into the community through contracts. And so just know that there are certain philosophies that funders have. And so when you're building your budget, really remember to understand that the budget philosophy by the funder. And so matching funds, this is a really short slide, and because I know Jennifer is going to be talking about this in a minute. When we're looking at funding opportunities, especially when you're building your budget, you're really going to want to immediately look to, okay, as I'm building my budget, build your match budget at the same time. Do not wait until the end to do that. And the other thing that I'm sure many of you know is we cannot match federal dollars with federal dollars. That's something that I know we've talked a lot about, especially in the era of COVID. Just know that with this influx of federal funding, there's so many different gray areas, and I feel like a lot of us are drinking from the fire hose. But just know that, again, understanding that the match in and of itself is going to have its own budget. The one thing that I will say that I've seen in my experience is that oftentimes funders may not ask for a match, but it's really good to show how much private investment or how much, I hate to use the term like skin in the game, but how much we're investing in this project. So it does look good to a funder. But again, as you're building your budget, make sure that you're building your match budget as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and I might be presenting or kind of chiming in, but Jennifer, do you want me to just flip through when you're done or do you want me to share the screen with you?
I've got it open here on mine. So if you wanted just to keep it on your screen, that would be fine. Or if you wanted to turn it over to me, I can share my screen, whatever more comfortable for you.
Yeah, I'll just turn it over to you. Sorry, guys. I want to make sure that in case of anything.
So then let me share my screen. And now I will work to get this on slideshow. Hold on. Oops. Sorry. Well, let me share the other screen, sorry. So now hopefully you're looking at a nice big share screen. And we should be down to financial budgeting. There we go. How does that look? Are we on a big, nice screen of financial budgeting?
Yes.
All right, great. Yeah, so just to basically pick up where Emily left off in terms of, something came to my mind when she was talking about make sure funders know the amount of private money and or unrestricted funds that the organization is using. We actually had that experience a couple of years ago with one of our funders, a private foundation, not a government funder, but a private foundation. That grant actually in its original inception, in its original budget, did not have any any coverage for administration or indirect cost, what have you. And then after COVID hit, we had some adjustments, and they actually allowed us to have some administration costs added to the budget when we did a budget revision. So just dovetailing on that, it's good, even if it's not required, to keep your funder knowing what you're doing. But financial budgeting at the get-go, schedule a meeting with your finance team. And I also recommend having other areas of the company involved even before you've submitted your grant application. But when you're originally thinking about applying for a particular program, getting the input, even at a high level, even if it's only a 1-hour brainstorming meeting, getting the input from other people in your company, whether they're facilities, HR, programs, development, marketing, et cetera, really helps to add some perspective to your program, and also potentially avoid some pitfalls that you might not be aware of in terms of being able to actually deliver. And so scheduling a meeting with your finance team, your grant writers, your finance director, your president is really important to make sure that people are speaking the same language. Consistency is key when you're writing the budget. We've had a couple of experiences where we divide and conquer. Okay, you take the budget, I'll take the grant narrative, you take the budget narrative, and you have 3 different voices preparing. And we've had experiences where I might use one word like supplies, for an example, where another person might use teaching supplies or teaching resources. And so the words do matter that we use, so that working together as a team from the beginning is really important. And the strong templates, that's another thing. Consistency is nice with your budget templates. Again, some funders have particular templates that they require you to use. And so, but there are some major categories you'll find from funder to funder, even from the government funders versus private foundations. There's some broad categories. For example, personnel, supplies, travel, other. Maybe you would have equipment. Contractors is another big category that a lot of budgets have some significant funds in. On your budget detail, it's very important to have a lot of line item detail. And this is where I think that the wisdom from Emily's elder in terms of water versus flypaper also comes through in putting together your budget. You want your budget to be detailed, but not so detailed that it becomes so restrictive in actually trying to execute your program. And we've had that experience where we had some very precise line items that were, once we got 2 years into the grant, realized we can't really buy those berry buckets, for an example. Because as you all know, or maybe have experienced, you might be conceptualizing the project, putting a grant together, putting the budget together, making the application, and then it might be months before the grant is actually awarded. And then it might be a couple more months before you're actually off to the races and running. So it could actually be 2 years from when you originated the ideas and some of those very specific details. So it's kind of, it might sound like we're talking about both sides of our neck. It's important to have detail, but also not so much that you're constrained. I think it's also important in your personnel to identify whether these are full-time positions, like a 40-hour week year-round person, or maybe it's a 20-hour half-time person. That's what that FTE, full-time equivalent, refers to. And the budget narrative, one of the things I've observed in different budget narratives is sometimes they're too granular or too detailed. And basically they're just taking the numbers and the expense categories from the financial budget and just regurgitating those into the actual budget narrative. I would operate under the presumption that your reviewer has the budget sitting in front of them, and then they've got the budget narrative sitting in front of them, and they're reading through the budget narrative, and then they're going to check, they're going to look over to the actual budget numbers to see if that flow makes sense or if that number makes sense. So I would keep less detail in the budget narrative and keep it more high level, like, why did we decide to hire one program manager and a half of a full-time equivalent of a coordinator versus maybe we decide to hire a half of a program manager and a full-time coordinator? That's just one example. But the narrative can flesh out and expand in more verbiage what the numbers are actually showing. I think it's easier for the reviewer to read that budget narrative. It's a bridge. And it is probably one of the more important elements. And again, consistency is really important to make sure that your budget is supporting the overall goals and project deliverable and outcomes of the grant. Sometimes there's a disconnect. The numbers that you decide to come up with, the staffing, the program, the contractors you decide to buy, in the numbers, it might make sense, but the budget narrative doesn't effectively communicate that. And so like Emily was saying, in the first instance, you want to make sure you have your overall strategic plan and your organization's long-term goals and what's the change narrative that you're working for overall. How does this grant program fit into that overall strategic plan? And then your budget narrative is the bridge that your reviewer can walk across to say, oh yes, well, that expenditure makes a lot of sense because they're focusing on this particular element or this particular need in the community. Let's see. Planned expenditures clearly support the grant project deliverables and outcomes. And that's where you can provide that context. Again, you're kind of bringing those numbers to life. And again, the standardized process, it's nice to have a template for a budget narrative and a budget form. Sometimes you can't have a company standard, again, because of the requirements of the funders and the different agencies. In-kind costs. So this is the type of thing in kind, or this might be match or recipient's federal share or recipient share, depending on which funder. Equipment, space, like for example, we have a big facility and oftentimes programs use the space. So we will look at the what's the market rate for rentals and facility rentals, or even just office space rental, and how much square footage do we anticipate to be allocated to this particular program. And then we'll multiply that, and that will be part of our in-kind or our match. So that's kind of different. It depends on the grant that you're looking for, what the requirements of the funder might be and what things you want to include there. I think as Emily mentioned, it gets a little bit difficult if you're going to be using indirect staff time to provide your match or your in-kind, because that's also covered by your indirect cost rates. So you want to make sure you're understanding some of the nuances there. The indirect cost rate, I'm presuming that people have some experience with either knowing that you have one, or maybe you've even had the joy of being able to calculate the actual numbers behind the proposal, but it's a very important part of your total budget, and it's included as a cost of the grant. So your program expenditures might be 150,000, and then your indirect recovery might be 27,000. So the total grant would include that. And it's the indirect cost is actually a direct cash receipt from the government for your indirect cost. And it's different than your federal share or your match, two separate concepts there. We negotiate our indirect cost rate annually. It's typically negotiated with the governmental agency that you have the most federal expenditures with. So for many years, we've been with the Department of Education in negotiating our indirect cost rate. Indirect costs are very defined term. So are a lot of the terms that we use once you kind of delve into this area. Part 2 CFR, Part 200 is where the cost definitions are. And I've included at the end of our presentation, we've got some direct links to some resources for you. But typically, an indirect cost is a cost that you can't easily identify as directly allocable or allocated to your grant project. So for example, if I'm hiring a culture bearer contractor to provide classes for our participants in our after school program, that's very easily, they're specifically hired for that. Whereas the rent or the utilities or the cost of the salaries for the administrative staff, you can't very easily identify where my time or where the facility for the admin was actually attached to that particular grant. So that's what indirect costs are. They can't easily be identified to the grant as opposed to a direct cost, which is your direct program costs. A lot of data on this screen, which kind of indicates the complexity of the indirect cost rate. But typically, you negotiate that once a year, and typically we find nonprofits are requesting a final rate for the year that just passed and a provisional rate for the next couple of years. And you use the provisional rate when you're negotiating your and applying for your different grants. And then once your year ends, you've got your financial data accumulated, you then submit your indirect cost rate proposal to negotiate your final rate for the year that just passed. It's very complex. If you don't have a financial statement audit or a single audit, it can get a little bit harder to put together these schedules because the statement of total cost, which is one of the key elements of your indirect cost rate calculation, breaks out all your expenses by grant funded activities and non-grant funded activities or non-federal programs, and then the indirect. And it can get very complicated, as can your allocation of salaries. And I've got an example that I can pop up here at the end to show you what that actual spreadsheet looks like. But typically the agency that you're negotiating with will have their form of template. Another note, you can't charge your indirect cost rate on contracts in excess of $2,500 or $25,000. There's a really great resource. There's a lot of great resources out there. One of them is a company out of Florida called My Fed Trainer, and they do a great job on both. They've got a blog, they also have free resources, and they also have some training that is both in person and online that can really help you get tooled up on that the whole world of Part 200 CFR and costs. So now we're going to shift gears here and say we've got our award, Yahoo! And what do we do now? And so it's really important, read every word of the grant award notice. That is actually quite good advice. And you want to get with your leadership team about staffing. For example, we've just received a couple of new grant awards, and some of them we're going to reallocate staff internally, and we also need to do some hiring of additions to staff. And so we want to make sure also to visit the application with your finance team to make sure that we are aware of what's going on with the expenditures and how to classify and code expenses as they come in. Online grant platforms, most of the grant agencies and most but not all of the private foundations are using platforms these days. Online platforms, and some are super easy and some are super not easy. It just depends. So you're going to want to make sure that you understand who is authorized in your organization. There's also SAM, which is kind of the overreaching government control where you have to register your corporation or your organization. Tracking tools, we have a grant log that we use internally. It's a super awesome spreadsheet that we keep track of grants that we are applying for and grants that we've won. And then I like this sticky note. I actually have a sticky note on my computer monitor that has all the active government grants that we have and what the platform is, what the grant number is, what the website is, so that I can just, when I'm, time to go do my draw request, I've just got my resource right there on my sticky note. So other people might have more sophisticated strategies, but I have found that to work. Bookkeeping, jumping over to the bookkeeping side, take care of your accounting department. You should have a coding system so you can easily identify what expenses are for what grant, first and foremost, so that it's, you don't get crossover of miscoding your funds. And internally use the grant code in all your communications about that grant. So I can like do a quick search, 3210 iLead, I can do a quick search in my email and find anything that might pertain to that. Interpreting vendor bills and credit card expense reports. We've started doing this the last couple of years. Greg's really helped us a lot here going forward on a couple of our newer grants. But your accounting department lives in the world of general ledger account codes, and they need to know at the end of the day, what account code does that bill to Michael's art supply store go to? because without a lot of guidance, we're going to assume that Michael's is art supplies, and we actually have a general ledger account code for art supplies. Well, it turns out that that Michael's art supply bill was actually teaching materials for a workshop that was going on. And so what we suggest that you do is create a resource or a map that has your general ledger account numbers on one side and your grant budget details on the other side, and the words that translate, like I talked earlier about supplies versus materials is one that's easy. Equipment is another one that you can get hung up on. Consulting, contractual, those types of things. That way, when vendor bills come through, it makes it easier for your accounting staff to code things accurately. Reporting, this can kind of get, there's a lot of words on this page, which indicates to you the complexity potentially of what we're dealing with here. On the financial side, this is different than your programmatic reports where you are writing narratives of your impact on people or your success in reaching your outcomes. This is really more on the nitty-gritty financial side. But typically there's quarterly reports, semi-annual reports, and annual reports. Oftentimes they're referred to as the SF 425 or the federal cash report. But typically they are keeping track of, the quarterly ones are keeping track of your expenditures and your receipts and making sure that the systems are lined out. So you're basically making sure that the government has correct allocation or correct data on what you've requested and what they reimbursed you, and that ties out with your general ledger. On the semi-annual and annual, it's more of an overall comprehensive. This is the total grant amount. This is the total expenditures to date. This is what's left. They're fairly granular and detailed. So as long as you've got a good way to capture your data for each unique grant, it should be not too much problem to pull from your accounting system the data that you need to fill those out. It's really important, though, that you pay attention to the grant year that you're reporting on. For example, in a 12-month grant, that's a 5-year grant in year 1, if the grant year end is September, I'm going to be drawing down funds for my September expenditures once my month is closed and I know everything I've spent. So I'll be going in October to draw down the expenditures I expended in September. I won't receive the September expenditures until October. So when I'm doing a grant report that wants to know my receipts and expenditures, I'm probably going to have all 12 months of expenditures for grant year 1, but my receipts is only going to show what I received, basically 11 months worth, because I don't receive that September money until October. And so that's one thing, an advice is I keep very detailed records of this is grant draw for year 1, this is grant receipt for year 1 that I received in year 2. So that is one thing that I've done to keep to help keep track of that. And sometimes the point at the bottom there, sometimes the reports, and I think this is more in the DOE, the 424 report, it requires a projection of what you expect to expend the coming year. And I'm sure the government uses that for their own budgeting purposes. Unless your grant is dramatically seasonal, I have found that it's easier just to take the full grant budget for the year, divide it by 4, and plop that number in each one of the 4 quarters. Again, like I said, unless it's highly seasonal, like if it's a summer season grant, you might spend 25% of your grant in 3 quarters of the year and 75% in the summer quarter. Well, then you would want to be more accurate, if you will. But those forms, and you have to worry about being precise there, and things need to reconcile. So it's an art as well as a science. Procurement, again, for those of you that have been in and around grants for many, many years, it got to the point where there was something called the super circular, because there were all these rules and they would post another rule and they would send out a memo and they would say, oh, we want to change this rule, that rule, this rule. And it got to be an octopus, and basically it was pretty much impossible to know if you were actually in compliance with the government. And so a couple of years ago, actually it's probably a few years ago now, they revised all that and issued new proclamations. And so there are a lot of resources out there, and I've included some, but you really want to make sure if you're on the financial side, and you also want your program managers to have some level of understanding of Part 200 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulation. On the procurement side, they've got different ranges of what's considered a micro purchase, a regular purchase, and then when you have to actually go out for formal requests for proposal and follow a very formal procurement process. We have sealed bids and the like. So typically a micro would be under $10,000, in which case you just want to follow your own company's cost policy, procurement, and payment policy. When you're in that 10,000 upwards, you are required to have 3 quotes. You are to attempt to validate the dollar amount, the reasonableness of the cost. And so that's why it's recommended that your internal policies kind of mirror the procurement requirements of Part 200 CFR. And your policies can be more restrictive. For example, our internal capitalization policy is $5,000, whereas it's $10,000 in the procurement requirements. You're going to want to have a purchase order process. Yeah, don't be afraid to ask amongst your community, because you can get kind of sideways here. And this is where we just went through a process where we've got a grant, where we've got a contract with an agency that's over the dollar amount that would be required to have a formal like procurement process. But because they are specialized, we're able to utilize the single source supplier exemption, if you will. So it can be a place that can get confusing. A monthly meeting between finance and program staff. We do a monthly budget to actual meeting, and where we get together and show the program staff what you've actually spent versus what your budget is for. And this is very helpful. We also include the marketing department and development department in this, so they know what's going on in the company. We also are available to provide details. Sometimes things get coded incorrectly. So those are good. Budget to actual meetings are good to have with your program staff. Allowable versus non-allowable, direct versus indirect. So allowable are expenses that can be either they're approved by your grant, or they can be included in your indirect cost pool. And so this is part of cost classifications, and it must be necessary and reasonable and consistent. Allocable, hard word, but to be directly attached to your grant and covered by your grant, it has to again be specifically identifiable, and it's going to be in your grant budget and what's your government approved. Unallowable cost is it can't be paid by your contract, and it's also excluded from your indirect cost pool. And some examples of that typically would be advertising, public relations, but not marketing. And if it's marketing that's specifically rated like hiring staff or promoting your particular program, those are allowed. But public relations is not. Alcohol is not allowed. Donations, entertainment and donor promotion and gifts, lobbying, staffed cards, gifts and foods, like we used to include in our direct cost without a separate GL. Cakes and cards for employees' birthdays. And one year, they were drilling down on the very detail of some of those other supplies, office supplies, food supplies and such in our indirect cost. They actually pulled out in the audit or in the negotiation process, cakes and cards. So now we put those in a separate general ledger, so they're easy to identify. But lobbying, interest expense, bad debt expense. And you'll see on the actual spreadsheet that you use to keep track or to present your indirect cost rate negotiation, there's actually a column for those that you can exclude. So they're in your numbers, and then you exclude them out and make a footnote at the bottom. Here's some resources. I was going to give you the templates that the Department of Education gave me for putting together our indirect cost rate negotiation this year. The AICPA resource has a really nice explanation of the schedule of expenditure of federal awards, which is a mouthful, but that's the schedule. Grant Professional Association, they've got some great resources. MyFed Trainer, they've got great resources and great training. A link to the actual 2 CFR Part 200, very exciting reading. But actually, in all seriousness, that link, you can actually just go and look at what's allowable, what's not allowable, reasonable. There's a single audit resource center. Those of you that need a single audit, if your expenditures are greater than 750, you're going to get a single audit. It's very excruciating, a lot of detail there as well. And then BDO does a pretty good job on their nonprofit servicing, and that's just a link to their website for that information. And dang, I guess that's the end of our show. That was
Well, Jennifer, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And what I want to do, just to build upon what Jennifer just shared in the resources, we're going to also be sending over some templates, some examples of any sort of like general ledger, but also some budget templates. And what I want to do before our time is over today is I'm going to turn it over to Greg. And so if Jennifer, if you could stop sharing your screen, and Greg, if you can, and I'm going to have Greg share an example of a budget, because I'm sure many of you and I'm sorry, I know it's Friday, it's in the afternoon, it's a lot of information with budgets, and this is something, it is exciting work and it's important work. And so what does all this mean? How do we apply it? And so Gregory, if you can maybe share your screen and share an example and walk us through kind of the skeleton of a budget so people can see. And like I said, we're going to be sharing this example with everybody.
Yeah, so I'll go through a couple of quick examples. I just wanted to show first an example that a funder will provide you with a specific budget that you are supposed to use. And so this is an example here of a DOE budget that we were provided that we had to go and utilize for a program. And you can see it's got very specific things that we have to fall into, very, very specific buckets, right? And so there's direct administrative costs, there's structural costs, there's project supervision costs, there's indirect costs. And this was used for a revision, but it's still pretty intensely sort of dedicated to specific areas. And you'll see that there's the personnel line items, there's fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, and then eventually you get down to contracts and sort of other, right? And so that's just one example of a really highly restrictive budget document that's provided by a funder. But we use, when we're kind of doing internal development, we have our own sort of template that we work with, which looks a little bit less frightening and daunting. It breaks down to the same categories. We still have personnel, fringe, travel, supplies, contract, and other are down below, but I'll spare your eyes with all the scrolling. But you can see we break it down for year 1, year 2, and year 3. And in our actual budget spreadsheets, we speak to the level of engagement that staff will have on the project. We provide a little bit of information sometimes in this about the cost of the actual personnel, so how much we're paying them and how many hours are expected. And you can see here how I do that. I provide a little more detail as to like how we came up with the number in the line items here. But then just to kind of highlight the other document that speaks to this, the bridge, is the budget narrative, where I can really provide a lot of information. So this is for that second budget that I showed you. I always do a big summary table at the top so that someone can kind of just get a strong sense of like how much are they asking for in each line item per year and over the course of the total project. And then we get into some language throughout the budget narrative that speaks to the details, right? So, we say 8 hours at $40 per hour for 52 weeks in year 1, right? 20% of their time. And so you can go through and you'll see that it breaks down for every single one of these personnel line items, how much time is going to be spent and how much money we're going to pay for that time. When you get into other items, this is a travel heavy project. We speak to the fact that we use, I think it was Department of Defense rates for the per diem and meals for the project in this one. The flights were all pre-researched, right? We went ahead and we just did a Google Flights sort of estimate, and the government lodging rates that were set, try to find some levels of standards that you can compare against, and so that you can show that the numbers you're coming up with are not pulled out of thin air. And this is where you can really show that you've done your homework. I think this is honestly a big lift in the world of budgeting, is writing the narrative to go with it. So those are just some examples of how we format them, what they look like, and I'd be happy to provide some of these templates to Eric, and then he can distribute onwards to anyone who might want some additional resources.
Perfect. So a couple things. One, I put the link to the DoD per diem rates. We use that within CITC, so that's great advice. I did also want to mention Jennifer's list about allowable versus unallowable. She's spot on with that, with the possible exception of food. Sometimes, depending on the granting agency, they may have flexibility. Department of Education, we typically don't have luck with, but some institutions may. Other than that, great presentation, you guys. That was fantastic. Do we have any questions at all from the group? You guys should be energized. This is an exciting topic to talk about on a Friday afternoon. Okay.
All right, thank you, Eric. And I'll just say again to everyone, when you're building your budget, feel free to reach out to us. I don't want to put Eric on the spot. Like I said in my introduction, the best way to start is just to start. That's the hardest part. And just really looking at like, what are when I look at it, it's like, okay, this big whale, how do we eat this whale? It's one bite at a time. It's one section at a time. And like I said at the beginning of my presentation, this is basically what you're asking the funder for. And it's your opportunity to really dissect the project. And like I said, it's just going to take time for you to build your expertise, but there's so many templates out there, and hopefully this is one training of many that you're gonna participate in. And like I said, we're gonna send out some resources, but always feel free to reach out. And know, like Jennifer said, reach out to your community, reach out to Eric, reach out to me, reach out to other people who are involved in grants. And if you ask, like, have you ever been in this situation about foods or about cultural gifts? And I will also say that, in addition to reaching out to Jennifer, Amy Fredine is an expert as well. And she's someone that I've learned from too. And, she used to work here at the Heritage Center. She's now with CITC. So just know that there are a lot of experts within our region that you should reach out to. And like I said, the number one thing though, is that the hardest part is starting. And then once you're in there, that when you start looking at it, I've even taken, and like full disclosure, I've taken some of my budget training classes for work. I've applied it to my personal budget. So that's a whole nother conversation, but know that this is something that, like I said, it's going to take time. Give yourself grace. And there's so many resources out there. Do not reinvent the wheel. So thank you again for this opportunity. Thank you to Jennifer. Thank you to Gregory, and especially thank you to Eric.
Excellent. Gregory, Jennifer, do you have any final thoughts?
Nope, I think we're all good. That totally covered everything. Thank you, Eric,
Okay.
and to all the participants and viewers watching. It's been nice to share our experience with you.
Perfect. So to close out, I will be sending an email next week with some templates that you can utilize, the link to the YouTube video of this presentation, should you want to share with others, and have a fantastic weekend and drive safely. The roads are a little bit icy today. All right, take care.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Drew.
Bye.
Bye.